A drone hovered over West Africa. At first glance, the footage looked like a military base, rows upon rows of structures stretching to the horizon. But then the voice of a French journalist trembling broke the silence. This, this isn't a base. It's housing. Endless housing. Thousands of rooftops made of clay and light, solar panels glittering in the Sahel sun. And at that same moment, halfway across the world, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before Burkina Faso's parliament holding up a document. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't a loan. It was something far more radical. 1.2 million homes, no rent, no mortgage, no foreign bank involved. The chamber erupted. Across Europe, headlines blared in disbelief. Commentators asked, how did he fund this? Where's the catch? But in Burkina Faso, the people didn't ask. They already knew. It began years earlier with a barefoot president making a quiet promise in a village swallowed by dust: you will not live like this again. Today, that promise has a roof, a door, and a key. And it's changing everything. So let me ask you, what if a nation could lift itself without permission, without debt, and without asking for pity? What if it could build freedom brick by brick? You're about to witness one of the most extraordinary stories of our time. A story about homes, but not just about shelter, about belonging, about justice, and about a future that is no longer for sale. If you believe that no child should fall asleep wondering where they'll wake up tomorrow, please share this video. Subscribe if you think the truth of what Ibrahim Traoré built deserves to be remembered more than the headlines ever told us. It began without cameras, without applause, without even a prepared speech. Just a man in worn boots stepping quietly into a village where no government vehicle had driven in over a decade. The village was dry-choked in red Sahel dust. A broken well stood silent. Cooking pots rusted in corners. Children coughed beneath a sheet of plastic that tried and failed to call itself a roof. And there stood Aminata, a grandmother barefoot and tired, her hands trembling as she tried to tie down the tarp that shielded her grandchildren from the burning wind. She didn't expect anyone to come, not after 50 years of promises. But he did. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't bring a convoy. No security team, no polished officials, just a small 4x4, a notebook, and his own 2 eyes scanning the wounds of a forgotten nation. He said only one sentence: "You will not live like this again." Aminata's knees gave way, not from theatrics, but because in that moment she believed him. Weeks later, in a cabinet meeting back in the capital, his ministers dismissed the idea. 1 million homes. With what money? What machines? What time? The finance minister scoffed. "We don't have the budget." Traoré stared back unwavering. "We have the people." And that's how it began. No ceremonial ribbon cutting, no donor conference, no international bidding process. Just a decision to build homes not for the people, but with them. He started with land. Burkina Faso had been carved up large tracts held by absentee landlords, old colonial families, foreign investors who hadn't set foot on the soil in years. Traoré pushed for emergency legislation, the Land Justice Reform Act. Any land unused for 5 years or held under expired colonial titles would return to the state. Not to sit idle, but to be mapped, zoned, and prepared for something no African government had ever dared before: free permanent home ownership for the poor. Then came the architect Kosi Dao, born in Burkina Faso, educated in Paris, celebrated in Dubai. He had built museums for millionaires, but when the president called, Kosi didn't hesitate. "I've built for the rich," he said. "Now I want to build for those who've never had a door. But with one condition: let the people build them." Traoré agreed. No foreign contractors, no cranes, no imported steel, just earth, sweat, and belief. And so it began. Villages became construction zones. Women molded bricks by hand. Children carried water buckets. Retired masons returned to teach the youth. The sun scorched, but no one stopped. Every worker was also a future homeowner. Every task, brick laying, cooking, surveying, counted toward a roof of their own. A girl named Awa mixed her first clay brick at age 7. A widow named Salamata led a team of 60 women. They called themselves the Hands of Tomorrow. One BBC reporter visited and asked, "Where are the machines?" A child pointed to her mother's hands. "She's faster than a crane," she said. By the end of the first year, 520's homes had been completed. Each house had solar panels, a latrine, clean water tanks, and a garden. Each family received a legal title deed, not a lease, not a loan agreement, but proof of ownership. No rent, no debt, no eviction. Traore refused to stamp his name on the buildings. Instead, he ordered that each house display a small plaque not with his face, but with the name of the first person who laid the first brick. In one village, a plaque reads, Plot 14, Village of Dignity. First brick, Abu, age 7. In another, Marama, 82, said she would die without ever seeing a real house. She didn't. Foreign media returned this time to marvel. But behind every statistic was something more radical than brick and solar trust. For the first time, people who had been invisible, displaced, voiceless, now had addresses, now had doors that locked, now had a place to say, I belong. This was no charity. It wasn't even just policy. It was a quiet revolution, and it was only beginning. At first, they called it a fluke, then they called it propaganda. But when satellite images from the European Space Agency showed dozens of new housing zones across the dusty belt of Burkina Faso, neatly aligned, solar-roofed, sprawling like rivers of clay, something changed. What had begun as whispers became headlines. What had been dismissed as populism now looked like proof. Across Europe, the tone shifted. Who's funding this? Is Russia involved? Is this militarization disguised as development? French talk shows erupted. A prominent analyst called it the silent fortification theory. A viral satellite image showed a grid of rooftops with the caption, Unidentified structures, foreign influence suspected. But inside Burkina Faso, the so-called foreign compounds were no secret. They were community kitchens built by women's cooperatives to feed the very workers raising the homes. Identical in layout for cost efficiency, clay-walled for insulation, recycled tin for airflow, not one soldier in sight, only mothers stirring porridge. Still, the suspicion didn't fade. It intensified. A German economist went on air, "This is unsustainable socialism. It will collapse." France 24 aired an exposé suggesting the project may be misusing foreign military aid. The World Bank, without statement, quietly pulled unrelated agricultural funding. And yet, the bricks didn't stop. In fact, they moved faster. Back home, something even deeper unfolded. A man named Musa, 72, stepped forward on national TV. In one hand, he held a yellowed eviction notice from 1979, typed in French ordering his family off land they'd lived on for generations. In the other, a fresh deed registered Republic of Burkina Faso plot number, GPS coordinates, legal ownership. He raised both. Then, he lit the eviction notice on fire. This, he said, as the ashes blew upward, no longer has power here. The crowd didn't chant. They stood in silence. Because everyone watching understood this wasn't just about housing. It was about erasing humiliation and replacing it with permanence. Then came the turning point abroad. In Brussels, a group of housing activists staged a silent protest outside the EU Parliament. One held a cardboard sign, Burkina builds without debt. Why can't we? In Paris, a retired teacher wrote in a local newspaper, "We spent decades lecturing Africa about development. And now a barefoot president has outbuilt us all." It wasn't envy. It wasn't outrage. It was a reckoning. In Amsterdam, a group of architecture students launched a campaign, "Can we be brave enough to copy Africa?" The movement gained a name, the Wagadugu effect. A challenge not just to economics but to imagination. But perhaps the most powerful reaction came not from protesters, but from someone on the inside. Mylène Varnier, a senior IMF policy analyst for over a decade, appeared on a live global finance panel. Midway through, she took off her earpiece and looked directly into the camera. "I spent 12 years designing debt packages for countries I never visited. We called it reform, but it was control. What Ibrahim Traoré is doing, it's not reckless, it's freedom." Then she walked off set, leaving her notes, her career, and the scripted narrative behind. 3 days later, she arrived in Burkina Faso. No press conference, no diplomatic title, just a notebook and a question. "How did you do it?" She was taken to a cooperative outside Ziniere. Rows of homes each with a garden and a plaque. Children played under solar lights. A mason handed her a brick and said, "This is our loan. Our sweat is our signature." That evening, Mylène sat with women from the kitchen brigade who had once worked as housemaids. They now ran logistics for housing projects across 5 provinces. She listened. She wept. And the next morning she proposed something no IMF official had ever dared. A community-run bank owned by the builders and residents offering zero-interest loans for expansion, not profit. They called it the Cooperative Bank of Housing. Its first loan was given to a widowed grandmother building a second room for her grandchildren. No interest, no fine print, just trust. International media tried to pivot. A French paper ran the headline Traoré's Clay Dream Hope or Hype. But below the fold in the comments section, something remarkable happened. European retirees, construction workers, and renters began to reply. Why am I still renting after 30 years? Why do they have what we only dream of? This isn't socialism. This is sanity. And back in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré stayed quiet. He didn't gloat. He didn't scold. At a press conference when asked whether he feared losing Western support, he said, "We're not building alliances. We're building homes. If you'd like to help pick up a shovel." It began quietly, not with a law, but with a sentence. A young girl named Abiba walking home from school twirled a house key on her finger. A visiting journalist asked her, "Who gave you that?" She paused, then smiled. My country. Those two words traveled farther than anyone expected, because in that moment something shifted, not just in the heart of a child, but in the spirit of a nation. Burkina Faso had always been taught that rights were abstract, that shelter was a market issue, that the poor could be helped but never guaranteed dignity. But now that dignity had a door, a deed, and a lock, and so lawmakers listened. Inside the National Assembly, a proposal was drafted simple in words, radical in consequence. Access to housing shall be guaranteed as a sacred right protected under the Constitution of Burkina Faso. For weeks the chambers debated, not whether homes were good, but whether governments should be obligated to provide them. Some whispered, it will crash the economy. Others asked, what if future leaders walk away from it? But outside the people were already answering. In villages, mothers painted their house numbers on signs. Children began referring to streets by their own names, the lane where Salamata builds, the place where Papa planted his mango tree. In Toma, elders gathered and declared a right delayed is a dignity denied. They marched not in protest, but in procession, holding keys above their heads. And then the chamber voted. The room was silent. No shouting, no political theater, just the calm sound of a gavel striking wood. The amendment passed. No longer was housing a policy choice. It was law. And not just law, but constitutional law, permanent, binding, non-negotiable. No citizen of Burkina Faso shall be homeless in their own land. President Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward and signed the parchment. Then he said nothing. No victory lap, no televised celebration. He simply laid the pen down in the National Museum beside three items: a handmade clay brick from the first house, a silver key with a blue ribbon donated by Abiba, and a copy of the constitutional clause handwritten on recycled paper. This, he said, is not a signature. It is a return. Outside crowds erupted not with slogans but with stories. In Bobo Dioulasso, a mason named Karem read the amendment aloud in the village square. Then he opened a notebook where he'd recorded every family he helped house. He added one line under the last name, "Now the law remembers them too." In Ziniare, a school painted the new clause across its outer wall in 3 languages. In Gawa, a grandmother renamed her house Faria, which means joyful shelter. But the shift wasn't only symbolic, it rewired civil life. Municipal governments now had a legal mandate to ensure housing access. Land registries were digitized and decentralized. Youth cooperatives handled paperwork. Community tribunals were formed to resolve land disputes before they escalated. Urban planning now required child consultation sessions, honoring the original vision of youth-led design. And perhaps most remarkably, Burkina Faso's incarceration rate began to fall, particularly for petty crimes like trespassing and informal settlement. Because people no longer needed to sleep on land that didn't want them. They had homes. International observers scrambled to respond. A Brazilian legal journal called it the boldest constitutional housing law in modern post-colonial history. Namibia sent a delegation to observe the implementation process. A professor from UCLA warned, if this works, it will force us to redefine the role of the state in economic justice. But inside Burkina Faso, no one waited for applause. They were busy installing solar panels on school rooftops, busy painting murals that honored bricklayers instead of presidents, busy filing title deeds not in backrooms but in community centers where children watched and learned, and busy living in homes that no longer leaked, no longer wobbled, and no longer whispered, "You don't belong here." And still, Traore refused to make it about himself. When asked what the law meant to him, he replied, "We used to rent our future. Now we own it." Let no law rise higher than the roof above a child's head. He spent the next week not in parliament, but in the village of Wagadugu helping build a health clinic beside a housing zone. When asked why, he said, "A home is not complete until it protects the body too." So as the ink dried on the Constitution, bricks were still drying in the sun. The revolution didn't end in law. It simply caught up with reality. Because in Burkina Faso, the law had finally found its foundation, and it was made of clay. In Washington, the footage rolled silently across multiple think tank screens, a barefoot girl holding a house key, a constitution amended with ink and brick, solar lights flickering across villages once labeled unreachable. At first, U.S. officials weren't sure what to make of it. This wasn't a coup. This wasn't an uprising. There were no tanks, no sanctions, no headlines screaming emergency. Just a quiet revolution spreading not through force, but foundations. But the implications ran deep. Migration analysts noticed a shift. For the first time in decades, net migration from Burkina Faso turned positive. Young men weren't boarding boats. They were building neighborhoods. Remittance-dependent banks in Europe and North America saw unexpected slowdowns. Burkina Faso wasn't just rejecting debt. It was no longer exporting its despair. In the United States, where housing insecurity affects millions, the story began to cut through the noise. A retired nurse in Ohio wrote on a forum, "Why does a village in West Africa have solar homes and legal deeds while I've been renting the same leaking trailer for 20 years?" A high school teacher in Chicago shared a clip from Abiba's interview with his civics class. The students stayed silent. Then one said, "We don't have anything like that here, but we should." Political voices were mixed. Some praised Traore as a visionary reformer. Others, particularly from conservative circles, called the program unsustainable populism and warned of property market disruption. One congressman went so far as to claim, "This sets a dangerous precedent. Governments should not guarantee home ownership." But outside the Beltway, the public wasn't buying it. Across American cities, tenant unions began referencing the Burkina model in campaign flyers. A small town in Vermont launched a pilot cooperative housing initiative inspired directly by Burkina Faso's zero-interest policy. At Harvard's Kennedy School, a visiting West African professor gave a lecture titled, "Dignity is not a loan product." The room was packed. And in an unexpected moment, a U.S. Department of Housing official asked, "Can we learn from them?" Burkina Faso had done something the world hadn't prepared for. It didn't ask for a bailout. It didn't beg for reform. It simply built its way out of dependency, one brick, one home, one deed at a time. And in doing so, it forced the world, especially nations like the U.S., to confront a question they've long avoided: if a poor, landlocked nation can guarantee homes for its people. Why can't we? If the world is truly watching, then it must ask itself an uncomfortable question. What if this was never about money? What if housing crises from Detroit to Dakar were not the result of poverty, but of priorities? Because in Burkina Faso, a country ranked among the poorest on earth, millions now sleep under solid roofs, not because foreign donors arrived, but because leadership dared to believe that dignity begins at home, literally. And if that's possible in the dry heart of the Sahel, what excuse does the rest of the world have? Yet, as powerful as this story is, it comes with a warning. There will be those who try to undermine this success, who say the numbers are fake, the policies unstable, the president a populist. There will be quiet moves in global finance to discredit or distract. Why? Because nothing is more threatening to the global status quo than a nation that solves its own problems without permission. Burkina Faso didn't just build homes. It built a mirror. And now that mirror is facing all of us. So we ask you, do you believe that housing should be a right, not a reward? Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective? Yet can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré, or should we support someone else to succeed him? Please share this video if you believe that home is where freedom begins. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. And let us know in the comments, should the United States take inspiration from the most unexpected place on earth, Burkina Faso?